afternoon, students. It's Sunday afternoon and I want to get at least the beginning of this lecture started for you for Chapter 14, Early Childhood Special Education. This is a really favorite area of mine. I love toddlers and preschoolers. They are, to me, some of the funniest and most enjoyable children to be around. I just really love the way they're playful and how they learn through play, and they're just like little sponges. You can almost see their brains developing as you interact with them. They're just one of my favorite groups of children. And this particular chapter is definitely about this age group of children, but those who have, special education needs. So they could really have a need that is represented by any of the chapters that we've covered so far. All kinds of things, right, that we have studied this year in our class. But these are often referred to as developmental delays, although they could be very specific and very much identified, through the medical community. So someone who, for example, has a cleft palate, or who has maybe fetal alcohol syndrome, those are, very specifically identified impairments that a child would have. So anyway, I guess the main point about this chapter is that these are, what we're looking at here is special education services that happen for children who are infants through their toddlerhood. So one category of service is really from birth to age 2, and then the rest of it is kind of age 3 through 5, which we generally refer to as the preschool years. And so that's kind of who we're talking about in this chapter, and it's an interesting way of serving children and their special education needs, mainly because of the importance of the family and parents. Because these are children who aren't in a public school setting, certainly not at infancy or in toddlerhood, the role of parents, whoever that is, whether it's grandparents or aunts and uncles rearing a child, or one parent rearing a child, or two parents rearing this child, the parents are the people who are spending the most amount of time with these little people, and they notice so much more than a specialist who's coming to visit the family once a week might notice. So as we think about the kinds of services that these children receive, I want you to understand how important and really how central the role of the parents and family is in making sure that services are well provided, and that people who live with this infant or toddler or preschooler, it's important to kind of train the parents. So me, if I had a child who had these needs, it would be really important for me to be trained to use some of the techniques that the specialists would use, because I'm around my child quite a bit, right? Way more than a specialist who comes once or twice a week for an hour would be. So I'll just go over some basic introductory notes about this. I've already kind of said a lot of what I wanted to say in the introduction. So these are developmental delays and disabilities that are mostly diagnosed very early on. And of course, in terms of providing care for these children and education, it is really true that the earlier intervention can begin for these children, the better. So right here in North Carolina, I wanted to point out that we have a very famous, nationally famous, probably internationally famous, Child Development Research Institute called the Frank Porter Graham Center. It's in Carrboro, North Carolina, which is a little town right next to Chapel Hill. Basically, Carrboro and Chapel Hill are almost one and the same now. But I'm going to try to put a link up so that you can look at the Frank Porter Graham Center and see maybe a little bit more about the studies that they have been responsible for, and the kind of work that they do. So if treated early, very young children can make significant gains in their functioning. And if not treated early, these children really show much more significant delays. And so in the first couple of pages of your chapter, of course, there are 2 or 3 or 4 research studies that are cited that are kind of the seminal beginning research studies to prove that early intervention for these little kiddos is very, very helpful to them. We've talked a lot about IQ scores and adaptive development, and it is just pretty much now a very well established truth that children like this can benefit significantly in their later IQ scores, in their later functioning levels. Sometimes they're functioning up to 50% better than children who don't receive any intervention. So I want to make sure that you understand that these intervention programs are now widely recognized as being effective and significantly useful to the children. So let's see. Early intervention programs also are pretty significantly helpful for infants and toddlers who are in homes that might be thought to be at-risk homes. And what we mean when we're talking about at-risk, it could be several things. So a child could be reared in a family where there's extreme poverty, not just your regular, modest upbringing kind of poverty, but more extreme poverty, including homelessness, right? But also children who have parents who have very low IQ scores. So maybe they have a mom who has an IQ of 70, which, remember, we've talked about IQ, and an IQ of 70 is 2 full standard deviations below the mean. So this would be one of the at-risk categories. Also sometimes, not always, but sometimes children who are born to teenage moms, so maybe a mom who's 12, 13, 14 years old, this mother probably is, not going to know very much about how to avail herself of information to make sure she's rearing her baby in the most stimulating way. She may not understand very much about babies at all, and also may not, at that age, be home with a child. Maybe she's in a school program, and so the idea of enriching and stimulating and doing intervention for an infant who has a very young mother could be another one of those at-risk categories. And so, the funding actually that can be provided, that is provided through federal service funding, does include this environmental category of children at risk. Another interesting and fun thing to think about, at least it's fun for me, is that children who are infants and toddlers, their whole way of learning in life is through play. And so they interact with the environment. We've talked about this a lot before, especially when we talked about the chapter of children who are deaf and blind, how important it is for them to be able to stimulate the people in their environment so that they get feedback and interaction, and how hard that is for a child who's deaf and blind, right? But most kids, and certainly all typically developing children, learn so much about the world by just interacting with the world. And so it's important for interventionists and special ed teachers and preschool teachers especially, but also parents, to understand that they can help their child make intellectual gains and social and emotional gains and language gains, language learning gains through play. And so these interventions will look like play, but they're very, very carefully designed by experts and expert teachers, and I want to make sure you understand that. There are some really cute examples and cool examples actually in this chapter. I'm thinking especially of the little outtake, if you will, that is about using puppetry, and how the use of puppets is a very stimulating way for young children to learn things like language and interaction, social emotional interaction. It's important for us to remember too that very young children and all children with disabilities have less chance of interacting with their peers unless they're in a setting where there are other young children available for them to play with. So of course a sibling is the perfect example of that, but if a young child with disabilities doesn't have yet a sibling, and a toddler, for example, doesn't have a sibling, they're sometimes just by virtue of the fact of their delays, so maybe not being as fast to run and have gross motor development, maybe not a toddler who can even get up and walk, they're going to not have as much exposure and playtime, if you will, with their peers who are on the move. So this is an important factor for us to remember, that the very intentional design of playtime and preschool interaction by teachers is to help these kids with delays get a lot of interaction with their peers, or as much interaction with their peers as they can get. So we'll talk about that a little bit more in another segment of the lecture. Like all programs for special education students, it's really important that these children's baseline abilities are measured carefully so that we know, what it is the child is able to do currently. And then, of course, as interventions take place, these expert teachers, special ed teachers, or even therapists who come in to help in a family's home, it's really important that they are measuring and documenting that this child is making gains. Partly just to see the growth that's happening and the result of the intervention effort, but also to see what needs to come next, and understanding where the child is. So for example, maybe if I'm thinking about trying to have an impact on a child's fine motor skills, so you'll hear and read in this chapter a reference to gross motor skills and fine motor skills. Probably they've talked about this in other chapters, but somehow in this chapter I think about it more. So gross motor skills are the large muscle group skills. So the large muscle groups like back muscles and abdominal muscles that are involved with sitting up, for example, or creeping on the floor. Those are, and then of course leg muscles and arm muscles are the other of the gross motor muscle groups. And then we refer to fine motor skills, which often is partly referred to the fingers and hands and pinching and grasping kinds of abilities. And so with children who have delays, sometimes their fine motor skills are delayed, of course. Certainly their gross motor skills are very likely to be delayed. And so these interventions need to be able to measure, how much of a gain is this child making in their gross motor development because of what I'm doing in the way of therapy for this child. And then, of course, parents are being taught these therapeutic games to play, or little toys to tease a child with so that they will ambulate and work on their gross motor skills to get nearer to a toy or a person who's playing a particular kind of therapeutic game with the child. So it might look like play, but this sort of early intervention is highly specialized, I just want to make that point, and requires very specific professional training. Modern early childhood special education teachers also employ some technology, mainly in their way of sometimes using adaptive technology that children might need, but mostly they're using this technology, the teachers are, to record and document how much progress a child is making. So a preschool special ed teacher might, do an exercise or some kind of an interaction in a circle on the floor with all the children, but be specifically digitally recording with a camera what a small child is doing who needs this interaction, and for whom this very specific game or play is being used to further develop some delayed skills. Also, these teachers might use digital recording kinds of applications or computer programs to keep to keep records of how many times a child practices a skill, or how many times in a play period a child demonstrates that they're using a particular skill that's being focused in on. I'm going to stop the camera because we're at a 15-minute mark here.